Hello class, I'm your instructor, Dr. Megan Workman. Thank you all for posting your introductions. I thought this would be a nice way to jumpstart our course. In response to the many of you who indicated that this is your first anthropology class, I thought I should respond with a bit of an explanation about anthropology as a discipline and then situate environmental anthropology within the bigger anthropological context. So that's my goal in this brief video. And I hope to respond to all discussions in this way, which will allow me to highlight information from the readings and videos you will be studying throughout the course. Environmental anthropology studies the many ways that humans interact with the earth. Now that sounds like a really broad topic, am I right? So let me boil it down with a couple of examples. As environmental anthropologists, in our class, we will study the ways humans shape the environments in which we live. So while doing this, we're going to think of human beings not as passive recipients of nature's gifts, but rather as active manipulators of our world. Humans change environments to suit our own needs, and that is one thing that environmental anthropologists study. Another example of topics environmental anthropologists study are the many ways that the environment influences how people live. So our lifestyles, anthropologists often call lifestyles life ways of living. These are constrained by access to natural resources in the local habitat, but also by political power to control those resources. So even if the resources occur in the habitat, not all people might have control over them. Environmental anthropologists study all of these different layers of complexity when thinking about how people and the earth shape each other. One thing I should point out is that our class is not about environmentalism. Environmental anthropology as a discipline is apolitical. So we're using our academic brains to evaluate evidence and to document things that are occurring. And then maybe wearing a different hat, an environmental anthropologist could become interested in environmental protections, but that is not the first job of an anthropologist. The first job is to observe and to document and try to understand what's going on. What all types of anthropology have in common is an interest in cultural variation, or how different groups of people think about things and experience life differently. So the answers to many environmental questions reflect our cultural backgrounds, like how we define nature, or what is the purpose of Earth's natural resources? What constitutes an environmental problem versus other types of problems, perhaps economic problems or political problems? And what is the symbolic meaning attached to the earth? Answers to all of these questions reflect our culture. To illustrate this idea, take a look at this beautiful photograph. This is an iconic, historic photograph taken in 1968. It's called Earthrise, and it was one of the first photographs of the Earth taken from space. This particular famous photograph was taken by the Apollo 8 crew from lunar orbit. So the gray that you see in the foreground is the moon, and that's Earth in the background. This and other early photos of Earth taken from space helped fuel the environmental movement of the 1970s, and descriptions of this picture that pop up in magazine articles of the day called Earth fragile and lonely. So it's attaching some symbolism to the Earth. And this matches a concept that I grew up with. Maybe you've heard of this concept too, Mother Earth, as a life-sustaining, perhaps loving parent even symbol. So the earth itself as something to be honored and protected. But I also grew up with this contrasting symbolic description of the earth. And here's a quote from a book that I was taught growing up. "Let mankind have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth." No mention of sustainability here from the book of Genesis quote. And that contrasts this idea of a pristine Mother Earth to be honored and protected. But does pristine nature even exist? Maybe it did once, but does it still? Did it ever? And so the answer to that question, I suggest, reflects culture. And that's one of the types of questions we'll study in our class. Okay, so environmental anthropology is a subfield of something called cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropologists aim to do a couple of things. The first goal is to document cultural traditions. So this includes documenting ways of life, spiritual belief systems, traditions, land use practices. So that's the first step. Maybe you travel someplace and you observe people living their life and you document how they do that. The second step is to understand. So this is the analysis step. And it's important to understand on a couple of levels. So it might be true that belief systems and ways of living make sense from a cultural insider perspective. And then they might make sense in a different way to me as the outside observer, kind of looking in from my United States upbringing. And these could be very different explanations. And so cultural anthropologists aim to assess both the insider perspective and the outsider perspective. And how we do this is through two key methods that you should remember for this class. And the reason I'm bringing them up is because all of the evidence presented in our course in the assigned readings were written from these methods. So the first method is called ethnographic fieldwork. Ethnographic fieldwork is involved. This is when you go there, you live among the people you're studying, usually for a period of years. You become fluent in their language, you feed yourself as they do, you perform the same types of work, you sleep in the same dwellings, participate in ceremonies as much as you are permitted to do. And that could be as an outsider. It could also have to do with your gender. Some ceremonies are for men only, others are for women only, others are for people of dual gender, etc. Basically, you embed yourself in a community for a long time in order to observe what's actually going on there. This type of living amongst the people and living as they do is called participant observation. You're not just like creepily roaming around writing down what people are doing. No, you're actually participating in community and thereby learning the expectations and the nuances of what's going on there. Here are some images of a famous cultural anthropologist named Napoleon Chagnon. He grew up in Michigan, so did I. Shout out, home state. Dr. Chagnon spent his adult life split between Yanomamo land, which is on the border between Venezuela and Brazil, and the U.S., which was his home country. And here on the left, he is pictured as a young man in the 1960s, and then on the right, decades later in the 1990s, working with the same community. The point is that he spent decades among the Yanomamo, during which time he documented shifting cultural concerns, many relating to environmental changes. Here's another image of Napoleon Chagnon doing participant observation at its finest. Here he is overdressed in terms of Yanomamo culture, and he's ritually becoming a Yanomamo man through a spiritual ceremony. And you can see he's wearing a feathered armband. This has symbolic significance to the Yanomamo. He's taking a certain stance that is appropriate for a Yanomamo man. And it is only through years of participant observation that he would have learned how to behave appropriately in this context. So this is an interesting photo, but it reveals the ways that anthropologists learn about the people that they're studying. It's involved. The result of all of this ethnographic fieldwork, all of this participant observation, the result is an ethnography, which is a written document describing a way of life, describing a culture that captures a snapshot in time and in geographic space. Ethnographers, that's what we call authors of ethnographies, they aim to understand the attitudes, perspectives, and motivations of cultural insiders, of the people who they're studying, why it makes sense to them. Ethnographers, though, also want to analyze cultural practices from an outsider perspective, often applying academic principles from ecology, politics, economics. Why does it make sense to me? And so the body of evidence that you will be evaluating in this class mostly come from ethnographies. Okay, the second method of cultural anthropologists is a philosophy of cultural relativism. So the first method was ethnographic fieldwork. The second method is philosophy of cultural relativism. This invites you to suspend ideas about what is normal and to withhold judgment. Cultural relativism is the idea that we should seek to understand another person's beliefs and behaviors from the perspective of their culture rather than our own. So to perform cultural relativism, or to be consistent with this philosophy, you're asked to suspend your own sense of what's normal, to withhold judgment, and to recognize that beliefs and behaviors may be internally consistent within that culture, even if they don't, at first glance, make sense to you as an outsider. The opposite of cultural relativism is what anthropologists aim to avoid, which is ethnocentrism. This is the tendency to view one's own culture as most important and correct, as most advanced, as most spiritually or morally correct, a pinnacle by which to measure all other cultures. So we're hoping to avoid this as anthropologists. As I said before, the information presented in our course was gained through this type of study. Perspectives were gathered via participant observation, and the authors were committed to cultural relativism. And they produced these beautiful ethnographic works of writing that are assigned throughout our modules. So let's briefly return to environmental anthropology as a subfield of cultural anthropology. Environmental anthropology seeks to gain a holistic understanding of human-environment relationships. For example, we may seek to understand a local practice of natural resource extraction in terms of both economic impacts and how this fits in with local spiritual beliefs. It is this "and" word that makes the analysis holistic and separates anthropology from other types of academic disciplines which may assess and evaluate concepts only through one lens or another. For instance, an economist might very deeply consider the economic impacts of a local environmental practice, whereas a theologian might deeply analyze how spiritual beliefs impact local practices. But anthropologists attempt to weave all of this information together to get a more holistic understanding of what's going on. An example environmental challenge in need of holistic analysis is ivory poaching. I doubt any little kid growing up in a part of the world where wild elephants roam says to themselves, "Gee, I want to be a poacher when I grow up." No. And yet many people turn to ivory poaching as a way of making financial ends meet. So as an anthropologist, I want to know every detail that goes into the poacher's choice to participate in this illegal, dangerous, and arguably monstrous activity, killing an endangered elephant for no other reason than to saw off its tusks. What political history, current economic circumstances, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions culminated in this being the best choice for the poacher to support their family? A second goal of environmental anthropology is to be transcultural interpreters of environmental knowledge, practices, and concerns. For example, an environmental anthropologist would document local solutions to environmental problems and share this wisdom with the Western world. So you could go someplace, document local happenings, and then amplify those voices through your writing. A third goal of environmental anthropology is to study environmentalism, the political movement, as a cultural practice and as an object of analysis. So you could document variation in people's beliefs and behaviors related to environmental protections and link them to history, politics, economics, and religion, and so on. To review, you learned two of the main methods in anthropology, which include ethnographic fieldwork, of which arguably the most important type is participant observation. And the second key method of anthropology that you learned about is this philosophy of cultural relativism, within which you try to suspend your ethnocentrism. We're all ethnocentric, so it's this attempt to constantly subdue it in order to understand other people from their own perspective. You also learned the three aims of environmental anthropology as a subdiscipline, which are to 1. Consider human-environment relationships from multiple angles simultaneously in order to gain a holistic understanding of concepts. 2. To serve as a transcultural interpreter of environmental knowledge. So you may learn environmental knowledge of a community living somewhere else in the world, and then bring that perspective back to the US, write about it, and share that knowledge broadly. And 3, to analyze environmentalism as a cultural practice. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.